All right, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Faisal Arif. I'm the Secretary of the Oxford and Cambridge Society Malaysia. In this edition, we'll be discussing Malaysia's migrant policy, balancing humanitarianism and nationalism. Our first guest is Ms. Deborah Henry, former Miss Malaysia World and Universe, who is now a humanitarian and social entrepreneur. Deborah is an advocate for World Vision and the UNHCR, representing Malaysia on missions to Brazil, Myanmar, India, and Lebanon. She co-founded Fuji School, an education hub for refugee children in Malaysia, and Fuji La, that provides skills training and employment opportunities for refugee youth. She has appeared on the Forbes list of Asian philanthropists and was nominated to attend an international visitor leadership program organized by the US State Department. Our second guest is Ms. Lilian Fan, International Director and co-founder of Gertanyo Foundation. I've spent all afternoon practicing that, a regional humanitarian organization based in Kuala Lumpur and Indonesia. She is chair of the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network, Rohingya Working Group, and joint head of the Secretariat of the All-Party Parliamentary Group Malaysia on Refugee Policy. She has 20 years experience working with refugees and internally displaced persons, regularly providing expertise to the UN, World Bank, ASEAN, and the governments of Malaysia and Indonesia. I have in good authority that was her birthday yesterday, so happy birthday, Lilian. So welcome to the show. Just to sort of like kick things off and help give some context to our audience, officially, we have a non-citizen population of about 3 million, according to the Department of Statistics Malaysia, of which 2 million have valid employment passes in Malaysia, 40% are Indonesian, 20% Nepali, and 17% Bangladeshi. However, some estimates claim that there are as many as 3.5 million irregular/illegal immigrants on top of the official figures. And thrown in the mix are another 180,000 refugees and asylum seekers registered with the UNHCR, of which 150,000 are Rohingya. So the first question is related to the challenge of terminology and quantification. There are so many overlapping categories: legal, illegal, irregular, illegal on arrival, formerly legal, undocumented migrants. There's also undocumented Malaysians as well that we get confused with. Statelessness versus not having documentation, being undocumented, and also distinctions in refugees and asylum seekers. That the first question I'd like to throw to both of you is there any country on earth that has a coherent policy for each category?
I feel like it's a quiz. Go ahead, Deborah. Can you think of any?
Yeah, I don't know whether Germany or Canada might have something a bit more sophisticated than us, but I think therein lies a problem, right? Because it's so much easier to just classify all of them as illegal and, have one policy where it's very hard line rather than sort of like have different sort of very subtle policies for each case. What's your experience been in Malaysia? Lilian, want to give that a try?
I would say that Malaysia is not a country where we have a very comprehensive policy on making that differentiation, right, between different types of migrants, different types of persons seeking protection, and persons who lack the right to nationality. Well, not the right, but actually lack a pathway to nationality, which leads to statelessness. So we are definitely not one of those countries that makes great distinctions, and we're a country that actually has, I would say, an inadequate focus on making those distinctions and inadequate mechanisms to differentiate between different types of persons who migrate for different reasons and who end up in different types of situations, who need different forms of protection or should be entitled to different forms of protection. If you ask about countries which do have good policies, I mean, I'm not sure any country in the world has perfect policy, but I do think there are certain countries, such as you mentioned Canada, Germany, countries who've signed the Refugee Convention would have basically, they would make that distinction between persons who are trying to seek international protection, so are fleeing their own country because of war or persecution or extreme forms of violence and discrimination, and those who are migrating voluntarily for primarily an economic purpose, right? So that would be the first big distinction. Then, of course, you have the distinctions within that. So you have, for example, the issue of statelessness. Statelessness is not something just affecting refugees. It affects populations within countries. So in Malaysia, we have Malaysians who are stateless. We have a lot of people in Sabah, for example, who are perhaps originally or many generations ago of migrant origin, but many have been born here, many generations. And then you also have stateless refugees, such as the Rohingya, who are stateless from Myanmar because they are not granted citizenship in Myanmar. And then they flee because of the lack of protection and travel to countries to seek protection, such as Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia, and others. So there are lots of complexities. And I think that it's precisely because of that that we do need to have not only the right categories, but the right processes, right? The right types of mechanisms and processes for making those, for conducting screenings and determination, and for being able to understand actually, what kind of experience a particular individual or particular group of people is having, why they've moved, whether it's been forced or is it voluntary or a mix of that, and then to look at what kind of protections are needed to be strengthened based on that.
And if I may add in, I mean, and it's also made worse by the fact, echoing what Leanne said, that there is no legal framework here. So everyone is branded with the illegal stamp, and that takes away your rights and degrees of protection. But it's interesting also to note that globally, there are countries that perhaps have not ratified the Refugee Convention, yet they allow refugees to work. And then you have countries that have ratified it, but they allow refugees to work, but in certain sectors. So you do find that globally countries, I mean, every country is different, right? The landscape, the economy. And so they have to come up with something that really works for them, perhaps. And that leads me to the point where, the fact one policy and legality is one issue, but also a huge amount of misinformation. And so we have a really interesting, false, misleading narrative about what it means to be a refugee, what it means to be a migrant worker, what it means to be stateless in Malaysia. And that is reiterated, I think, across the board from top down. And so you do get people in positions of leadership that pretty much say the wrong things and make inaccurate statements. And it's a very strong misleading narrative. And that's what I think trickles down to society. So the man on the street is utterly, utterly confused and wrong and misguided in how he views people.
Mm-hmm. If we were to sort of just focus on Southeast Asia, it seems that Malaysia is a beacon for a lot of migrants, a lot of refugees, and it sort of runs against the way that they are treated in the country. Why do you feel that there are so many migrants and refugees who come to Malaysia in the first place?
I think I'll just quickly jump in. I think a degree is also because we are, as a Muslim country, Muslim majority country, I think lots of refugees in Malaysia are, religion is Islam. And so there's that degree in perhaps thinking that Malaysia could be kinder to them, more welcoming. I don't quite see that as reality. The second part is also because Malaysia offers visa on arrival for many of these nationalities. They wouldn't be able to even gain access to another country in this region, whereas they can get a visa, come into Malaysia for 14 days up to, I think, a couple of months, depending on your nationality. So easy access. And then they're basically here, and then they claim refugee status after that. Of course, if you look at the Rohingya situation under Prime Minister Najib, he was very supportive of the Rohingya people.
I remember that.
Muslim, and I think Malaysia built a hospital in Cox's Bazar. We obviously didn't want many Rohingyas to come to Malaysia. We wanted to help also with where they were, right, back home. And we had a very open acceptance towards them. But that obviously kind of quickly changed years later.
Yeah. Deborah, you mentioned just now. Oh, sorry, Lillian.
Sorry, Faisal. I was just going to say, I think that I agree with what Deborah was saying, but also we can't ignore the structure of our economy, right? So I think if we're talking about migrants and if we're talking about refugees, it's two things. I mean, we are a country that, at the time that we gained independence, we were already really constituted by the experience of migration, right? And that is part of our colonial history. It's part of our post-colonial history. And it's very much part of the way our entire economy has actually been structured, right? I mean, we have, 25 to 30% of the labor market here is basically migrant labor. So there are sectors of our economy that have only been able to grow because of the migrant, labor contributions, right? And these arrangements. So that's the migration side. And then I think, yes, with refugees, it's definitely that perception of Malaysia as being a country where we have a benevolent form of Islam, that we are tolerant. These are the perceptions that, many people from countries where they're facing war, these are the perceptions they have. And I think it's a bit of a shock to them, particularly in the last few years when they've actually seen, a lot more xenophobia and anti-refugee sentiment. It was very much a shock to them. But I would also say that another reason why a lot of people come here is family reunion. So that's a big reason why Rohingya, for example, many Rohingya are coming to Malaysia, not just because they think Malaysia is a great country, but because they have relatives here who moved here maybe 10 years ago. And it's just becoming, completely untenable to remain in Myanmar and increasingly also to remain in the very destitute camps in Bangladesh.
Yeah. I think both of you have mentioned the word perception, right? The impression that Malaysians have towards migrants are quite negative, even before the pandemic. How can sort of that public perception be changed to view migrants as an asset to Malaysia? Deborah, you do quite a bit of work training up some of these refugees, and then they get jobs, and I think some of them even start businesses over here. How can we shift the perception of them? So taking away jobs from Malaysians, but also, sort of like converting them into people who contribute to our economy. Because as Lillian said, we are a nation of migrants, and this nation was built on the back of migrants.
Well, I think that's why this whole situation is actually very interesting, because you look around you, everyone has come from somewhere. And yet we tend to have this approach of don't come here and don't take from us, go away. And so specifically on refugees, Ideas think tank came up with a very strong paper quite a few years back, and it talked about the contribution refugees would make to our economy if allowed to work. And so I think they looked at a number of about 3 billion GDP, if I'm not correct. Obviously with the best data they could find. And the reality is refugees are here and they are already working. So we need to recognize that and bring that into the light in order to be able to understand it better and to have a framework that supports it. Because the other alternative is just exploitation and trafficking and everything illicit that can go on. It is very important. People need to be willing to be open to something that a different idea. And that's why I go back to my earlier point, is that the media plays such an important role. Leadership plays such an important role. And if we look at, recent times with COVID, scarcity, fear, putting fear into people, loss, it makes people fear the unknown. And also the fact that refugees, while they are urban and they live amongst us, they also are to a large degree isolated. And this isolation decreases their opportunity for integration, decreases their opportunity for assimilation. And so you have that further divide between the host country, the host population, and the refugee population, not really understanding and getting to know each other as much as they could. And then the reality is the data shows us that we talk about, opening the floodgates and that they're going to come here and take all of our jobs. And, we have so many millions of migrants in our country working in certain sectors. And so refugees would, the large bulk of them would probably work in a lot of these similar sectors. And so are they really taking a Malaysian's job? So it's been an interesting narrative. We've shifted from refugees being the invisible threat in Malaysia to then, that little grace period under Najib. And now they've become pretty much a threat to the health and safety of Malaysians. So it is quite politically convenient as well. But if I could share a quick story, one of someone I know, he's of Palestinian heritage, and so his family and himself have been living in Malaysia for 10 years. His father is highly qualified, professor, and given the opportunity, they would have loved to have called Malaysia their home and a permanent base. But we didn't see the asset in them being here. A lecturer, professor, and eventually he just said, you know what, I can't live like this anymore year to year on work visas. And so he found a better alternative in Turkey. And Turkey pretty much accepted him, and he's a lecturer there now. So it's really seeing refugees, they're not a homogenous community, seeing them as, with their assets, they come with all that they can actually contribute to the economy. They can, as they are already doing so. And actually, there have been many case studies in Denmark, in Turkey, that show positivity in numbers and figures. So we're not talking about emotions, but we're talking about facts.
Right. Lillian.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, there have been numerous, mayors, right, of towns, even in Italy or, Germany, who've actually come out and started saying things about how the inclusion of refugees and, the work that refugees are contributing to is really helping them to revive their economies. And I think that's important. I mean, this was even before COVID, but this was at a stage when, Europe was in recession. So that's important. These cases, which are really based on, real evidence, is extremely important. And it's critical that we find a way of, looking objectively at this issue and really understanding that people are not coming here. People are coming here, particularly when we're talking about refugees. They're coming here because they are under threat themselves. And the number that we have in Malaysia, it's an enormous number. It's actually really tiny. It's really not very large at all. And it's possible. So, the issue is that it's actually not going to threaten anyone, right? Integrating 200,000 people into certain sectors. And frankly, not all of them will enter into certain sectors either, because also, refugees don't come here with the objective of finding a job. So they're not coming necessarily with, construction skills. Some will fit into those sectors and actually some won't. There are some who are single mothers who will never be able to, get a job outside. They'll have to find a way, for NGOs to help them or to do something at home, right? So there are lots of complexities that come with it. This population is vulnerable, but they don't want to be dependent. If there's a way to support them to actually not be dependent, that's really what makes sense. It makes sense in every aspect. I remember even during the time of Prime Minister Najib Razak, when there was this sort of big push for supporting the Rohingya. I mean, I think part of it was, rhetorical, but I think one of the good things that happened was there was a conference in Putrajaya. I remember because I attended and I brought some of my Rohingya staff as well. We basically had a discussion with almost every ministry about what it would mean to sort of integrate, Rohingya into the picture, right? So what would it look like? What are the key issues in the health sector? What were the key issues in education? There was a real discussion going on. And I think that didn't go far enough. And, under the next government, some issues were picked up as well. And, the successive governments, certain issues, I think, were ignored for a long time, but hopefully there's a chance now to have another discussion on certain things. And I think the work right issue in particular is very likely, going to be of interest to this government, precisely because of the labor shortages, because of, the realization that, in fact, it's not really there isn't that much opposition to it. In fact, I think there's a lot of rhetorical opposition, but in reality, employers are contacting UNHCR and NGOs on a daily basis and asking, we want some refugee workers. Is it legal? How do we do it? How do we find some permission to do this? So I think there actually isn't a lot of opposition to work rights, and we need to realize that. And it could contribute to our own economic recovery.
I think both of you mentioned how the sort of like mood turned 180 during the pandemic. I think the turning point was sometime early 2020 when this viral letter went around. Basically, a Rohingya leaders asked for sort of the right to work in Malaysia, education for the children, healthcare, and things. And it was interpreted as a demand, which didn't go down very well when 800,000 people were unemployed because of the pandemic. But these are, at least on paper, they seem like uncontroversial sort of rights, very, very basic things. But it also starts to look like citizenship. And I think that the broader question that a lot of people have at the back of their minds, is it acceptable to prioritize the needs of Malaysian citizens over migrants, or is that something controversial?
Perhaps Lilian, you can start.
I think it is controversial. I mean, I don't think giving rights shouldn't be exclusive. These rights are universal, right? Human rights. Okay. We're talking about really basic human rights: the right to health, the right to education. These are so basic. The right to a livelihood. The right to work legally. I mean, these are not controversial things, really. The right to send your kids to school, whatever school that might be, whether it's Fuji school or, a government school. I mean, there are options here, but the right to education, such a basic right. You're talking about things which, have been basically since World War II, they've been cemented in the Human Rights Declaration, which we are signatory to, so why are we so shocked when people ask for basic human rights? I think that's question number one. Number two is, it's not about asking for citizenship. I mean, I don't think the Rohingya have ever asked for citizenship here. What Rohingya are asking for is citizenship in Myanmar, and they are not getting it. They've not been getting it since 1982, right? The 1982 citizenship law that was passed under the one of the former regimes of the military regimes of Myanmar is still in place, and it's going to be in place for probably a long time to come, until something dramatic happens in Myanmar and that citizenship law is reformed. So, I think we really need to separate, right? I mean, what are the rights of citizens? What are the rights of non-citizens? But what are universal human rights? I mean, this is a really basic thing. And that's, I think, part of the problem of the way we see these categories and we act as if they're not entitled to human rights. I mean, that's, I think, a real, it's really a flawed understanding of something so basic, which really needs to be addressed.
And even the fact that these refugees they are under UNHCR, they have even a blue card, UNHCR card, and Malaysia is, as of now, a transit point. So resettlement in Malaysia and home in Malaysia, as of now, is not really on the table. So what actually has been pushed is for the time that these individuals are in this country, that they are given some, as Lilian said, basic protection. It's protection to exist. And the reality, the hard, cold fact is that we have these 180,000 and more individuals in this country who are refugees, and they are here on humanitarian grounds. And so do we sweep this? It's not something that's happened for the past 2 years. And this approach of, we don't address it and we pretend it doesn't exist, then they'll stop coming or they'll leave because we don't look like a fun country we don't look very appetizing. But the reality is the numbers are pretty constant. I wouldn't say hugely growing, but they're pretty constant. And it's been decades now. So we have to address the issue very simply put. And the situation has to change from one of charity and dependency to one of self-reliance. Some framework that allows individuals to take care of themselves and to take care of their family.
Deborah, you mentioned the numbers, right? And I've been looking at the Department of Statistics Malaysia numbers on our sort of official numbers on non-citizens, and I noticed that they've come down quite a bit. I think 2018 it peaked, right? And then it sort of like started to come down. the number of valid employment pass holders have also decreased. I'm just wondering, because the big opaque part that we can't see is the number of irregular or illegal migrants in the country. Has that number come down as well because of all the repatriation efforts that we've been doing over the past few years, or is it just a conversion from one category to the other? From legal to illegal. Have you heard or seen any stories of sort of like mass repatriation happening over the course of the pandemic, as it were?
Lillian's probably best to answer this, but from my knowledge,
she's smiling.
From my knowledge with about the migrant population, I do believe that there's been quite a bit of repatriation,
Right.
job loss, and because of obviously a loss of employment, and also I think with they paused giving out more permits, right? So I don't believe there are.
That's right.
A lot coming into the country. So I do think across the board, you see with migrant workers, many have returned to their countries. But then that to me is, okay, that's for now. Who knows what this year and next year are going to look like? Who knows if there is another, 500,000 people going to suddenly arrive? And so why not use the available labor force that you have in this country currently?
Exactly, Lillian.
So there has, I would say on the migrant side, definitely the numbers have gone down because there have been a lot of detentions. And I think this is a really big issue we need to talk about, the detention of, undocumented, irregular migrants, including people who came in legally and then became undocumented through their fault of their employers. They're also subjected to this. And many refugees are also subjected to detention because there's really no mechanism to verify, status, and also no mechanism currently to get people out. So the detention issue is a huge one, and many people in detention have been deported. There was, I think, a very visible deportation to Myanmar that we saw, which happened after the coup, and it caused a lot of outcry. It's a complicated issue because there are many migrants who actually would prefer to return, right? So I think it's not about saying nobody should be deported. That's not the point. The point is, humane deportation and making sure that it's voluntary, and ensuring that persons who will be persecuted upon return should not be forced into that situation of, being forcibly returned. And that's a basic international principle of non-refoulement. This is one of the most basic principles of international refugee law, and everybody's bound by it, actually, including countries who haven't signed the convention. It's not something which just comes when you sign the Refugee Convention. That's one thing. I think the other thing really is, understanding that. So the Immigration and Home Affairs basically has started, I think, in recognition that we also do still need foreign workers. Maybe there's a way to, to regularize persons who are undocumented. So we have this recalibration program, for example. The recalibration program, I think the intentions are really good, but I also think the implementation's been quite problematic because in reality, migrants don't really have, that bargaining power, right, to choose the employers. It's so much is put on the onus is so much on the employers, and employers aren't always the most, not generalizing, but I think sometimes, some employers don't see the benefit in doing that, right? Some employers actually see a benefit in keeping their workers undocumented and not investing that much, even though it's not actually that expensive, to be honest. I've looked at some of those figures, but there are people, and I would say, I think Deborah and I are much more refugee specialists, but there are lots of, migrant specialists out there too, and some really great analysis and reports that have been done. So the Bar Council has done a really good report, for example. There's the North-South Institute. So these are places that you can go to as well to really understand the details of the migrant issue, from the migrant perspective, right? And looking at, how protections for undocumented migrants could also be increased.
And I think just to reiterate what Lilian said is, it's a vicious cycle that's not really going to end if we don't, solve the root problem. And this is a cycle of bringing migrants in. They become illegal. There's a huge degree of exploitation, lack of protection for them as workers here. and then when we decide to go after them, it's very they make a perfect scapegoat. They have very little power, and we blame them, and so that's a really horrible thing to do. So this is where I think the government needs to be firm about what their policies are, and to hold companies and corporations accountable when you do bring in and hire workers. And a quick example, last year when we were doing food aid, we were giving out food aid to everybody and anybody. We actually were going to construction sites where there were these big kongsis with hundreds of migrant workers, and they had no food. Yeah. Some of them for up to a week, and they were sharing bags of rice. So whose responsibility is that? They come to our country, they build our buildings, they are a very physical, tangible contributor to our development, and feeding them was like, of course, society stepped up and we took care of everyone during this, and that was the best picture of Kita Jaga Kita. But it was very sad that companies and corporations, so many of whom really abandoned their workers. And so I think these are really important parts in this puzzle.
I mean, I'm just baffled by this somewhat. It seems to make more sense to regularize the existing pool of migrants we already have in the country, rather than bringing in fresh migrant workers. And yet, every time, as you say, the cycle comes around, we're very over-eager to bring in more fresh migrant workers. Any idea why that's the case?
Well, I will say that talking about, and I've spoken to quite a few friends who work in architecture and construction. We have migrants who come to Malaysia. They live here for, I believe, 5 years, some 10 years or more. They learn a lot of skills. They're specialized. They're highly skilled. And the saddest part about this is that it reaches a point where I believe you can't extend your work visa or permit, and you have to go back home. And that is, just from we're losing talent. That's like yet another form of brain drain in this country. They come here, we're training them, we're not keeping them, we're sending them home. So we have a big issue, I think, as a country on the whole, when it comes to recognizing talent. I think, be it Malaysian, migrant, refugee, we're not able to recognize talent, see people as assets, and really keep them, invest in them. So that, I'll talk about it on that end as to why we keep going around and around. Maybe Liliane.
I think there are incentives, right? I think people are gaining from it. There are people who are, I won't mention it, who, it's not my area of research, but I do think that there are particular, individuals or conglomerates or clusters of, stakeholders who benefit from keeping things the way they are, keeping people undocumented, making it, benefiting from levies of migrant workers. So I think we really need to look very seriously at that issue, right? And, we're not...
And educate the public as well on that.
Absolutely. There has to be a lot more transparency in the way, the entire migration governance is conducted, and all the different parts of that, right? So, there's the labor issue, there's the refugee issue, there's how do you prevent persons from becoming undocumented? How do you get people regularized if they do become undocumented? How do you look out for, really vulnerable groups? It's not just refugees, but victims of trafficking, for example. Screening mechanisms could be put in place. And I don't think we really just need to, we don't need to look very far. Countries like Thailand have improved on this. Thailand is another country where there's an enormous migrant population, mainly from Myanmar. But for so many years, it's obviously a mixed migrant population. It's migrants and it's refugees. It's victims of trafficking. There are lots of other people from other parts of the region as well who end up in Thailand for all types of trafficking, right? From sex work to, forced labor and others. So they've taken steps. It's a country that made a commitment globally. During the global conferences on the global compacts, it actually stood up and said, we are forming this screening mechanism, the national screening mechanism, and it's being rolled out. It's being rolled out now. How do you identify a victim of trafficking? How do you put in place a system that you can make those distinctions? And what are the protections that are actually needed for such vulnerable people? So that's not that much of a stretch. We're not talking about let's become Germany. We're talking about let's look at our neighbors. Let's look at Thailand. Let's look at Indonesia. Indonesia doesn't have has also not signed the Refugee Convention like most of the ASEAN countries, except for two. Only Philippines and Cambodia have signed. But Indonesia has a disembarkation, basically a presidential regulation that allows for safe disembarkation of refugees when they are in distress at sea. It's not always implemented, but it has been activated. And recently there was a boat that arrived just on New Year's Eve, actually 2 days before New Year, off the coast of Aceh, a Rohingya boat. And they used that framework, that legal framework, to basically allow for a coordinated response to disembark the refugees from this boat. And they're currently still in Aceh. And, our team is there responding to that crisis. But it's done legally, and it's done in a coordinated way. UNHCR and IOM are allowed access the very minute people arrive, or even before they arrive. There's coordination. They're there on the shore. The Red Cross is involved. NGOs are involved with the local government. So there are models in our region, literally next door, that we could look at. And it's not to say that, Malaysia doesn't have the right to protect its borders. I mean, nobody wants to encourage smuggling. Nobody wants to encourage trafficking. But it's about managing these flows and managing, being able to make the distinction between, I think when we say humanitarian or nationalism, I don't think it's really about that choice. It's about management of, very real problems in a way that, preserves dignity, preserves the human everyone, but is also a balanced and appropriate response, right, for, a sovereign government.
And I think we have to,
sorry, Deborah.
I think we have to decriminalize this refugees and migrants. We treat them like they are criminals, and they are really not. I mean, and so the whole framework, as Lilian said, needs to change with that. And I draw comparisons to COVID. We did something amazing when we said we're going to vaccinate every single person in this country, but that's because it also protected us. So in a way, perhaps it was selfish, but it was a decision that was made from top down to protect everybody, because protecting everybody meant that we remained safe. And I think that shows us how interconnected and how interdependent we are. And even the title of today's discussion, it's we live in a world that is so globalized that what problems don't respect borders, what borders to a large degree. And especially now with climate change, more refugees also come from climate change. And so what is that going to look like for the world? And so it's so critical that we really change how we view this entire topic, because I think we keep thinking that it won't affect us. And the reality is it does. And so it's not to say, I mean, it's not about sweeping it under the rug anymore, but really dealing with it. And I could just mention the Tent Foundation came to Malaysia a few years ago, and they were, it's actually, I think, chaired or headed by, I think Hamid, I can't remember his last name, but he owns that yogurt brand Chobani, and he was on a mission. Yes, so we're quite familiar with the yogurt now, but he was on a mission, I think, in upstate New York, and he just sort of accidentally hired a bunch of refugees to work, and he found them to be amazing workers. And he started this beautiful initiative to encourage MNCs and companies around the world to commit to supporting refugees, hiring them, giving them opportunity. And so they actually came to Malaysia, signed a few MNCs here and Malaysian companies, and really tried to lobby the government. Yeah, they tried to lobby the government to allow refugees to work legally, and to show that the private sector was more than willing to support this. And so it didn't quite get to where we wanted it to be, but I think that's something that Lilian and I and many of our organizations push so strongly here to allow refugees to work legally.
Lilian, interesting. You mentioned Thailand a moment ago. I think we're both tier 3, right? Malaysia and Thailand on the U.S. State Department's sort of like tier list, as it were. How much teeth does that have with sort of policymakers in Malaysia and also Thailand? Do we respond to those things? Do we take it very, very seriously? Oh, did we lose Lillian? She's just stunned by that.
Sorry, I'm back on.
There you go. All right. Okay.
It does actually have teeth. I think it's really important because there's a lot of credibility in this, in the TIP report, and I think there's a level of, countries will push back and they'll claim that it's not necessarily accurate, but I think that there's such a level of global credibility with this report, and the assessments are extremely thorough, that I think it does have an impact, and not only on the governments, but it has impact on the economy, right? So, it will influence decisions about investment. It will influence decisions about trade. It will influence decisions that have an impact on the private sector and on, industries, right? So I think that it is extremely important. And I really do hope that our government is taking it seriously and going to take steps to address it. That we do, of course, have an amendment, right, of the trafficking persons law that's just taken place. So there's been a lot of lobbying about increasing protections, broadening definitions of exploitation, in that law. So it's obviously to be seen if the amendments will be adequate, but also I think more importantly the enforcement, right, and how we view working on this issue. It's not just, as Deborah said, it's not just about criminalizing. It really does need to be also about protection. And there's that balance in that. It's a very, multifaceted phenomena. And I think particularly when you're talking about refugees, you can't ignore push factors, right? It's not just about, here are these criminals bringing people from one country to another in irregular, through irregular means. When you're talking about smuggling, right? Not just trafficking. But people leave willingly, yes. And why do they use smugglers? It's because there are no legal routes. So the Rohingya, for example, right? There are certain nationalities who can come, used to be able to arrive and get a visa on arrival, and then they will just overstay. So Palestinians, for example, they can come without having a visa. They come here and then they overstay. That's basically one way of arriving. For the Rohingya, you have no passport. You have no you ever going to get on a flight. It's not like you can, come and get a, basically come over with a visa or without a visa. So they are forced to take irregular means of traveling. So I think we really need to look at this with a social science lens as well. And it's not, look at what's happening to these communities because of the situation that they're actually in. Start from what's actually the reality, the social facts, right? And then look at, the legal definitions, what the response is. That's my anthropological bias as an anthropologist, but you just need to start with social facts. It just doesn't make sense, I think, to start anywhere else. You really need to understand what's happening at the community level and why people make the choices that they're making.
I think no discussion will be complete without mentioning the Unhcr card. It's a point of controversy, like among a lot of enforcement officers in particular. They have expressed a lot of frustration. Colloquially, they call them card cabal, immunity cards. Like, the card holders, they just can't do anything to them. And part of the frustration that I'm hearing from the government is that they're not involved in the issuance process of those cards. At the same time, I think the UNHCR is very resistant towards them being involved because the motivation for enforcement is to, enforce, right? So on the one hand, you want a group that want to document and quantify, as it were, and the other, want to enforce borders as such. What are your views on the challenges and sort of like the way forwards for this particular issue?
Well, if I take one example last year when I believe the government said, please come out and get vaccinated or get tested and we won't arrest you or detain you, and then, all
Trojan horse.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, the trauma that people go through with that, and the families, the children, the women, that's something else, you know. And it's at times like that I really hope us as Malaysians, as the host country, can actually put ourselves in someone else's shoes and realize how scary that is for people. So when you talk about trust building, there needs to be consistency over long periods of time. And if you don't have that, then who's going to know? You know, an individual would rather risk something worse than to be faced with that. And I can say this as running a nonprofit, focusing on working with refugees for more than 12 years, even running a school. We were reluctant to, when the Ministry of Education, who had never attended any meetings, never looked like they wanted to participate over the years, when they finally started engaging, and they wanted to get a list of all the refugee schools and the names of all the students, we were like, whoa, hang on a minute. And why do they want this? And what I mean, out of the blue. And so I think it works for all of us, you know. Even myself, I did not trust the relationship. And so, I mean, I'm sure UNHCR has their reasons, and what goes on behind closed doors, we do not know. But the government has to show some consistency. Every time there's a change of leadership, the whole focus and direction changes. And so it's literally 2 steps forward, 3 steps back perpetually. And it doesn't allow for all the parties involved to be able to make, you know, a good decision and a good conscience to be able to take the working relationship forward. But I'm sure Lilian, she's far more involved in this side of things.
So I would say that the government has every right to want to know who's in the country. I think that's you know, the right of every government. That's obviously you know, part of national security. The issue, though, is that we don't have a refugee policy. So, and we're not anywhere close to designing one, you know, to formulating a national asylum policy. And it doesn't need to be, you know, cut and paste from the Refugee Convention. It should be something that suits us. But that's really important. So if we want to be able to take the lead, as, you know, the Malaysian government does intend to or would like to, in, you know, determining status, right? In looking at, you know, keeping all that data and, you know, having us. I think that the requests now, it's a bit knee-jerk. It's sort of like we panicked during COVID because we realized, my God, there are all those refugees out there and we don't have the data, right? And there are all those undocumented persons. So then it was sort of like, well, let's just get the data and let's just take over without actually having the skill set. You know, it takes years actually to build that skill set. And there are countries that are doing that. I mean, you know, there are countries in the Asian region, like, you know, Korea and Japan, for example, that have signed the Refugee Convention and are developing their national asylum systems. There are countries who have not signed the Refugee Convention, but are also developing asylum systems, right? So it's really about looking at where we want to go with policy. And then as part of that, working with, you know, the mandated UN agency that really has a global mandate on this issue. I think UNHCR would be more than happy to be able to hand this over to the Malaysian government, but it's their responsibility to ensure that they do so in a way that meets international standards. So, you know, I don't think we should be seeing this as, you know, I think it's been a little bit caricatured, you know, this kind of tug, right, that we've, you know, been seeing, particularly as it's blown up in, you know, political statements. It's not about that. I think it's not about, oh, government wants this and UNHCR wants that. No, I mean, the UNHCR would love to see the government leading it. NGOs would love to see that as well. But we also want to know that it's being done in a way that protects refugees and, you know, is done in alignment, right, with basic international standards on refugee protection.
Lilian, you've mentioned that we don't have a refugee policy, as it were, and at the same time, you're also the joint head of the Secretariat of the All-Party Parliamentary Group, Malaysia, on refugee policy. During your tenure, what have you seen? What sort of discussions have taken place, and where do we stand? I mean, it seems like we're on the verge of yet another election. Continuity obviously will be a bit of a challenge. Where maybe take this opportunity to tell the public a bit more about the let me get this right, the APPGM, as it were, and its role in formulating refugee policy.
Absolutely, Faisal, my pleasure. So I think the
Yeah.
APPGM on refugee policy it's such a needed platform, because one of the problems I think about discussing refugees and what the policy should look like, what's appropriate, has been that it's been so politicized. And the APPG has found a way to have those discussions, surprisingly enough, with many political parties, very bipartisan, in a way that is less politicized, precisely because you're talking to political parties with an understanding that this is a bipartisan issue, that there's concern. And it's one of the important things is I think that we've been doing most of the discussions behind closed doors. So that builds trust, right? It's not about standing up and talking to the gallery in Parliament and making a statement that gets put on the media. It's not about that. I mean, people have their platforms to do that. This is really about sitting behind a closed door and hashing out difficult issues. Listening to the Ministry of Health, listening to UNHCR, listening to refugees, listening to the National Security Council, and taking all the concerns seriously. So giving equal measurement to, this is MKN's view. MKN has concern ABC. Not just countering that because of what an NGO might think, but actually really taking all the concerns seriously, seeing things from their point of view. Same thing with the views of UNHCR or the refugee community. And then trying to see, actually, and you will be having consultations also with private sector and local communities, right? So local communities who are living side by side with refugees. This has to be a whole of society approach, right? We're never going to come to a policy that is appropriate and sustainable in Malaysia for refugees unless you involve as many stakeholders as possible. So, it may not be the perfect policy in the eyes of NGOs. It may not be the perfect policy in the eyes of, refugees. But if it's not a policy that people can agree to, that private sector can agree to, that local communities can agree to, and that the government feels comfortable with, it's never going to last. So you also really need, I think, this is a space in which that thinking is taking place. We're not close at all to sort of designing a refugee policy, but I think what the APPG has achieved in the last 2 years has really been to have quite a number of consultations. It was slowed down because of COVID, of course, but there still have been consultations online. And because we keep things very confidential, we've been able to build a level of trust, between the MPs in this APPG with government agencies. We're very careful with not sharing the content of the discussion that takes place because it is confidential. So I think that's a step forward. That's a really important step because we're listening to each other. Instead of just talking in the media against each other.
I've just realized that we're almost hitting the hour mark, and I've been completely neglecting some audience questions. We've got one from Theodore. He's asking, how can the Malaysian government or people prevent modern day slavery or human trafficking in Malaysia? Any thoughts, ladies? Yeah, go for it.
I would say learn from Thailand. Like look at the trafficking. Look at the screening mechanisms. That's one thing that we can do. We have to really put stronger penalties in place as well, and not just not just symbolic and tokenistic penalties of 1 or 2 officers. I think a lot of trafficking happens because there are stakeholders allowing things to happen. So, we really need to also be able to increase the investigation capacity, right? The enforcement capacity and all of this. And then the screening of, who are you criminalizing? There are criminals involved. They absolutely need to be penalized, but, who are the criminals, right? And how are we ensuring that there's much more consistency in being able to enforce that? So that would be one thing that I would say, and looking at screening mechanisms and protection mechanisms of how we treat victims.
Deborah, any thoughts?
I think Lilian said it all.
Yeah. Okay. All right. The next one that we've got is from an Asha Dillon. her question is, when considering the wider impacts of an outbreak of infection in host communities, it's not only a duty, but also in everyone's interest that support is provided to the most vulnerable and marginalized groups, including refugees and immigrants. I think the idea is that no one can fully be safe until everyone is safe. Any thoughts on that, like from the epidemiology perspective?
Well, I think I mentioned that, sort of touched a little on that earlier.
Yeah.
And I think there are lessons that we should learn from that. I think lessons our government should learn from that, or even society, that we did something which was inclusive, and it benefited all of us, and nothing bad happened. So I think with that same approach, you have to look through that same lens when it comes to addressing other social issues in this country.
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that struck me personally was that when this Kita Jaga campaign, Kita Jaga Kita campaign initially came about, it's sort of like us coming together and taking care of each other. But then it's sort of like, once the Rohingya backlash kicked in, it's almost like we were more focused on defining who is Kita, and to the exclusion of people we don't consider as one of us, right?
And I sometimes wonder, who are those trolls or those? I mean, the comments were so nasty, and a lot of people got attacked, and it wasn't really based on a lot of substance, to be honest. It was very personal, and so I mean, and I did actually have conversations with some individuals who had what they claimed to be unpleasant experiences with some Rohingya refugee individuals, and to me, I mean, in any situation, there will be individuals who you may not like, who may not be the nicest, and that can happen in any part of society. That's like saying all Malaysians are good people. We're not. And that's one. And also, I do think it's a little bit more isolated. I question how rampant is this? How much of the population in this country feel that way? And I do believe that Malaysians, we are very compassionate and generous people and welcoming. And that's why, for me, it's, have you met someone who's a refugee? What is that relationship like? And I think as long as the barriers are still kept up between peoples, we see that person as the other, and we tend to fear the other, fear the unknown. So I mean, and Kita Jaga Kita is something that I hope all of us hold on to beyond COVID, and realize that actually the strength that we have, even the floods, did we see the incredible feats that people were doing for each other, risking their own lives to help someone else. And so these are all really important elements for us to hold on to, and realize actually what is leadership? Who are the people that we entrust and give so much responsibility and power to, when actually it is within us to be that change, or to make that difference.
I mean, we've got a question from Chaco. He's asking that, in that regard, has COVID been a silver lining? And I've got my own question, which is sort of like opposite to that as well. Has the Rohingya backlash caused irreparable damage towards Malaysia's refugee policy? Right. On the one hand, you could say yes, it's brought us together. We are more conscious of taking care of everyone, not just our own. But on the other hand, as advocates towards policymakers, have you noticed like a very clear, if not permanent, shift away from your goals?
I work on the Rohingya a lot, Faisal. So I would say that it's not irreparable, but it's done a lot of damage, extremely, really deep damage. And I do think that a lot of it was very orchestrated. It was, we were at a point when we were counting the number of Facebook campaigns, right? And a Valza campaign and whatever it was, all these different platforms. There was like 30 something of them at one point, with, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of signatories. I mean, it's just impossible that that's spontaneous. So I think there's really a level of
organized,
very organized. However, I do think it's had an impact, right? Because there lots of people then started having questions, but I think this very sort of organized campaign of mistruths was very much targeting one of the most vulnerable communities that we have in the world. And that's just, to me, absolutely, I mean, it's shameful. It's really shameful.
Yeah.
And I'm not, I won't mince my words in saying how unacceptable it is that this happened.
Yeah.
However, it happened, right? So what's the damage that's been done? I think that at the local level, there's been a level of unease for a while. And I think that this hate campaign, the hate speech and all that xenophobia, the orchestrated xenophobia sort of sparked, I wouldn't say grievances, but feelings of unease that had no channel to be expressed for a long time. And it's exactly one of the reasons why we need policy, right? Because, policy gives you a shape of how to manage things. It gives you the ability for authorities to go out and have meetings with community leaders. It gives, leaders of local community the ability to not be scared and actually hold members and community and leaders of a refugee community accountable, because you have a framework, right? It's like a social contract. So I think without the policy, I mean, it's just leading to so many problems, including social issues. And I do think that it's not irreparable, because there's a lot of work already taking place at the local level, even with some of our MPs, bringing communities together and listening to each other. And part of the problem is that because we have no refugee policy and we just sort of try to brush it all under the carpet, there's no program here that actually helps refugees understand how to live in Malaysia. There's no literacy, language program. There's no adat program, cultural sort of familiarity program. I always remember, and I've told this story a number of times, but our current chair of the all-party parliamentary group, he is the MP of SIK in Kedah, YB Ustad Tamizi. And YB Ustad has told us a story where there aren't that many Rohingya in his constituency in SIK, but there are a few. And, Rohingya like to eat sireh, right? This, the betel leaf. So they had gone to local pakcik, and he was growing this betel leaf. And they asked him whether they could pick some, right, for their consumption. So pakcik said, yes, please, silakan. So the Rohingya went, they picked the sireh, they ate it. The next day they came back and they just petik, they didn't ask tak minta izin. So Pakcik felt quite upset with this. And then he started to complain to, Ustad Tamizi and the other locals. And the Rohingya didn't realize that, this was upsetting. Because for them, Pakcik already said, yes, it means, every day you can go and
blanket, exploit them. Yeah.
And nobody explained that to them. So of course then Ustad Tamizi had to go mediate, and he explained to Pakcik that, they've been through all this terrible experience and they have zero education and this and that, but they really aren't meaning to be rude. And he explained to the Rohingya, please go in with that izin from Pakcik, because that's Malay culture and it's very polite to do that. Now they understand each other. Now they love each other. And Pakcik is planting more sireh, right, for the Rohingya neighbors to enjoy. So all these things can be solved, but you need communication, and you need to have that level of, an environment where you're not fearful of approaching the other, right? And keep, continuously making somebody this sort of, demonizing them and making it, this illegal, this talk of criminalizing everyone. Locals afraid to actually understand someone. Who is that neighbor? Who is that foreigner? It just puts this demonizing figure and, figure of illegality. So you feel that even if you approach someone or talk to someone or have a meal with someone, that you may be breaking the law. So it really goes all these ways. And, we're not going to have an environment where we encourage communication and understanding if we just go down this route of, demonization.
Deborah, any thoughts? No. Okay. Again, I think we've passed the hour, but I'd just like to ask both of you, we have GE15 coming up around the corner. What would be your migrant and refugee policy wish list for the upcoming Malaysian government? Like if there were 3 things that you wanted to ask Santa for, if we were to think of our ministers as Santa, what would they be?
I would say one super important one would be the right narrative. I think in this talks on communication, on compassion. So we need to start using the right language when it comes to refugees. And that needs to happen at all levels. And I do think it matters that it comes from the top. as much as we all of us can talk about it on our social media handles all day long. Second would be creating a framework that allows refugees to work. I think that would be one of the most important empowerment tools that will change the landscape considerably for the community and for a lot of us NGOs and organizations that work to support them while they are here in Malaysia. And the third one is, I'm not actually asking for refugees to even attend government schools. I think that's very complex, and I think our school system needs to be fortified a lot more before they can inherit the refugee population. But I would say, I think, create a more open conversation with the Ministry of Education and a better pathway between the MOE and statelessness and refugee, and a lot of children. I think we need to have some part of this needs to focus on the protection and rights of children, because they often are the ones that suffer the most in these situations. So really, child's rights protection, we have child rights here. It's not such just an issue that affects Malaysians. So children's protection / education.
Lillian.
So I would say the first would be will allow for the formulation of a framework that works for us, a legal framework for refugees, which would include, aspects that Deborah has mentioned about legal right to work and the right to education. But I think also, very importantly, that basic documentation that basically allows you to not get arrested and put in detention just because, if you're a criminal, of course, if you've committed a crime. And I think that's something that really needs to be clarified again and again to the authorities. Having a UNHCR card, being a refugee does not mean that you're immune, right? You have no kind of immunity from the law, right? But that's important. It's really important that people understand that. And actually regularizing, the status, giving some form of legal documentation also means that you can hold them accountable for breaking laws, right? In a much easier way. That's not so ambiguous. So get rid of those gray areas. I would say it's kind of an addition to Deborah's wish list, because I agree with all the asks that Deborah has too. But really, this issue of detention, being able to give access to the right institutions, HCR, if UNHCR needs to have access to detention centers. It could be done in a way that they're, accompanied. So if the government really feels, they have, I think, a lot of nervousness about UNHCR because they have this perception that HCR will just go in and, give cards to everyone. That's not the case, right? I mean, HCR has very tight procedures, but do it in a way, even if it's gradual, but we can't be stuck in this situation where we have thousands of people in detention who can't go anywhere. You can't deport a Rohingya because Myanmar will never accept them, for example. We're really putting people in a lot of suffering for, very unnecessarily, including children. And that's extremely important, right? We do have now a pilot on alternatives to detention, but it doesn't include Rohingya. So there are lots of things, I think, that need to be done. And taking a more, I think, a broader institutional reform on this entire host of issues, right? The migration, trafficking, refugees, and statelessness as well. Even for statelessness, I was told there's really no institution that's actually responsible for even monitoring, having an overview on how statelessness is being addressed and the vulnerabilities of the community. So I think the institutional reform is extremely important to address this entire host of issues.
That's on the government side, right? Theodore Chaco and FAM 5437, pardon me, all are asking about what individuals can do in Malaysia to help protect refugees, migrant workers. I think FAM 5437 also asks, like, changing the narrative, as it were. Chaco is saying, like, how can we get stories out there? I think you mentioned just now that there were like 30 Facebook groups. Is there a need for a public perception campaign to offset that, as it were, among the public?
I would say yes, but it also shouldn't be one-sided, right? Because I think part of the problem is that it's been so, this side or that side. What I would love to see are conversations where it's really about bringing Malaysians and refugees or Malaysians and migrants into the same conversation, right? And having honest conversations with each other, not pretending that there are no issues. So it's not just about, we love refugees or we love migrants. I think it needs to go beyond that, right? That's important. It's kind of symbolic statement, but let's really address the issues, because if it's really about living together and understanding each other, you can't be shy also about addressing issues that may exist, because you need to resolve them. So I think having more conversations where, like, getting more refugees and migrants on panels, for example, where we're discussing refugees, right? I mean, and also not just valorizing people, not just putting them into a position where it's all about, the solidarity is important, but it's also about, how do we encourage, leaders of that community also to listen to Malaysians, right? One of the things that we did recently was to bring refugees to PPRs. This was a few Ramadans ago, for example, so that there's an awareness, right? That, actually there are lots of people who are suffering and there are lots of people who are vulnerable, and you need to, sort of get to know each other. And refugees loved that. They loved being able to, go out and volunteer with the homeless community, the street community, going out to Orang villages, going out to PPRs and making friends there. So I think it's really important, for the cross sort of conversations to take place.
Yeah. And if I may add, I see this, and perhaps because I am in this line, I see this all the time. Everything that the audience mentioned, it's happening. The relationships, the number of universities now that choose to for their, I think when they have to do these projects, community service, they seek out NGOs and organizations that work with refugees. Even over the past 2 years with the pandemic, we've seen community-led refugee organizations work so closely on the ground with Mercy Malaysia and other organizations to deliver aid, to deliver vaccinations, to help each other. Even recently with the floods, I think even the Lian, you were on the ground with your team. So it's actually happening so much, and perhaps it's happening in pockets that are a little bit too small and not getting that kind of a trollish attention that other things get. But it is happening. And so I think I would just say to the individuals, it's speak about it, use your voice, use your platform, to talk about this issue. And I think the more of us that do talk about it, and if you can, I have friends who run small businesses, they do hire refugees to work in their businesses. So even within your own circle, see what you can do. That's not just charity, but it's also very much empowerment, so people can take care of themselves. I think that's the greatest gift you can give someone or a family in a situation like this.
Okay. We've got a question from a Mark Disney. He's asking, Malaysia is not party to the 1951 Convention on Refugees or its 1967 protocols, but nor are India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, or Indonesia. Why is this?
I don't know, Lydia, do you know? I don't even think the US is they're not, right?
Okay.
I don't know if they are.
They have refugee policy.
I think they are, but they have so that's the whole point. In India hasn't signed it, but India allows refugees to work, and there is some sort of a framework of sorts. So it's a very interesting dynamic globally, where on one hand it is important to sign the convention, and that does hold you accountable to especially resettlement, which we see refugees obviously from Malaysia are here on transit and they move to countries like New Zealand and Canada, but it doesn't stop a country from creating their own policy. And it gives you that perhaps degree of flexibility to determine what works best for your country.
Exactly. I mean, some of the countries on that list, look at Bangladesh and Pakistan in particular. I mean, these are, the largest refugee camp in the world is currently in Bangladesh, right? Kutupalong.
Okay.
There are over 1 million Rohingya refugees, or close to 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh at the moment. There are so many refugees in Pakistan, and they've actually gone they've taken steps, right, to, allow for education, even to allow for some, forms of work. So it's not that you need to sign the Refugee Convention in order to grant certain basic rights. Iran is another country. Iran has a lot of Afghan refugees as well, and there are certain things that Iran is allowing, refugees to do. So we can't. It's not so black and white. It's not just about sign the convention. It's about come up with a policy that is suitable to your country, but is also aligned to the international standards, right? That takes into account those basic human rights that refugees should have, should have upheld.
Yeah. On that note, it's 9:15. Lillian, Deborah, thanks so much for coming onto the show. Any closing thoughts? I'll give you both an opportunity to sort of like say your piece, as it were. Lillian, let's kick off with you.
Well, I don't know how many people are listening in and who the audience exactly is, but I think that no matter who you are, there is a role to be played, right? Because we are talking about an issue that is not just a humanitarian issue. It's an economic issue. It's a human rights issue. These are not issues that will go away, right? And when we're talking about refugees, you can't wish those issues away because people are going to keep trying to find protection as long as the situation in their countries are not solved. In Malaysia, we won't have the power over solving all those issues, but we can influence the way we choose to treat people and uphold their basic human rights. So I think there's a role for everyone. That would be my closing message.
Deborah?
And in the years that I've been doing this, there's nothing quite like seeing families and mothers and children that don't know what tomorrow is going to look like. They don't know hope, or perhaps some of them have to hold on and create such an intense hope just to wake up the next morning. And so it was a trip I made to Lebanon to visit Syrian refugees in a camp, and I've got quite a strong stomach, so to speak, and that was the first time where I was truly devastated at the situation of a mother showing me. She said, I carried my child who was hit by a stray bullet across the mountain range, and I buried her 20 meters from the house. Would you like to see her grave? We have to stop penalizing individuals who are fleeing war and terror. And, I would just, I don't know, and I don't think we can truly imagine this unless it happens to us, but, to try to put ourselves into someone else's shoes. I think Malaysia is such a blessed country. We've not known disaster and calamity like many of our neighbors and other nations. And so being able to be, not saying that we don't have our fair share of problems, and any country always will, but to really try to put ourselves into someone else's shoes and come at it from a place of compassion. And of course, the framework and all of that will come with it. But I think that first, it begins in, here. So, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Lillian, Deborah, you've been absolutely wonderful. Just to share with the audience, we are hoping to make this into a three-parter. So the first part will be nationalism and humanitarianism. The second one will be the economic debate of migrants in Malaysia. And the third one will hopefully be a policymaker forum. We'll be sort of like working hard in the next few months to try to put all of these things together. Again, thank you so much, Lillian, Deborah. Hope to see you guys around, and I hope that the conversation will be ongoing, and we get to see a sort of brighter future for a lot of the migrants and refugees and asylum seekers in Malaysia. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you to our audience.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
for
you for having us.